contemporary argument, which is the so-called crisis of manhood. And you'll see this referred to again and again in the blogosphere, in the pages of significant magazines, and quite recently the Atlantic Monthly ran a piece called All the Single Mothers, lamenting the decline of marriageable males who are able to be in a sustainable relationship with modern women. So this idea of the disappearing father has become something that, despite these kind of rather vehement second wave feminism that prevails amongst the chattering classes and in the political elites in the modern Western world, has become one way in which a crisis has emerged, and people are starting to ask about the extent to which the human species can move away from its historical norms in directions of sort of often morally driven social engineering without actually breaking down in some fundamental way. So the crisis of manhood is behind, in many ways, the crisis of the modern family. So 1 in 3 children in the United States now is fatherless, is brought up without a father. And many people will say this is not a problem, but in fact 75% of high school dropouts actually are from fatherless backgrounds. If you're brought up without a father, you are twice as likely, almost twice as likely, to get into addiction or into criminal behavior than if you've been brought up in a traditional two-parent family. We now find that even though only 35% of teenagers are in single-parent situations, 67% of youth suicides in the Western world are amongst people who have not had a father figure in their lives, whether they be male or female suicides. 9/10 of suicides are actually male, but it affects the girls as well. So there's a growing awareness that something is not quite right and that there is an absence. And this idea in the Atlantic Monthly that there just aren't enough marriageable men is something one even hears about in the Muslim community. There seem to be plenty of girls who are up for marriage and are looking for men who can be breadwinners and reasonable partners, but somehow there seems to be a shortage. So this is one of the deep imbalances that the modern world has found itself in. And one manifestation of this might be the way in which the mass media has changed in order to reflect what society now takes to be its official truths, its social beliefs. Just to take a topical example, the new Star Wars film, The Force Awakens. The Force Awakens, you have to think about the theological implications of that, but it's called The Force Awakens, and the story is extraordinarily derivative of the story of the first Star Wars film, down to every small detail. It's a very strange thing to do if you're making what you hope will be a blockbuster. There really isn't an originality in the plot except for the question of gender. What has changed over the last 35 years or so? What has changed has been the collapse of the traditional idea of the male hero and the rise of the idea of the autonomous woman who is really beyond reproach. So what we find is that really the key character now is not Luke Skywalker, who's he's sort of sulking out at the edge of the galaxy somewhere. He's not really being a hero and trying to deal with the evil empire. He's kind of licking his wounds and being a bit of a loser. Instead, the one who is central to the story is, of course, a female, and a very young female. And by some amazing post-initiatic capacity, she is able, even though she's living on some dump of a desert planet, she is able suddenly to fly starships better than Harrison Ford ever could. She's able to fight with robots, and she can use lightsabers, and she's a kind of amazing super warrior, even though she's just a little girl. And her name is Rey. Now, Rey, is just about everybody knows, actually means king. So she has a name of a kind of patriarch, the traditional symbol of male sacred and secular authority, which is the king. She now gets that name, and these things, of course, are very carefully chosen. Now, the original Star Wars myth was based on Lucas's discipleship of Joseph Campbell and his famous groundbreaking book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which is all about steps of initiation, essentially from boyhood and childhood into manhood. the monomyth, the characteristic idea of the male that overcomes himself, that is able to deal with the female principle in its positive and negative dimensions and grows into a kind of role of sacred warriorhood. And that's present in all of the Chinese, the Indian, the Islamic, universal legend, as he saw it, of humanity. And he used this essentially sacred story with its sort of quasi, slightly hippie-ish dimension of the Force be with you as a way of retelling for modern cinema audiences a really ancient story that everybody can relate to. There are some very ancient archetypes there. Now that's no longer acceptable, because the idea of initiation has been absent in our society for a long time. Some people will say it's the Reformation that did away with it. Others will say the Enlightenment. But the idea of the teenage adolescent being taken out into the rainforest by other males of the tribe and initiated into mysteries, or passing through ordeals of various kinds and being initiated into maleness, which would mean a sacred initiation, also an initiation into warriorhood and being a hunter. Something very primordial, as Campbell saw it in the human experience, has been abolished, as unacceptable, and is forgotten. So we don't really have ideas of initiation in our culture, and we certainly don't have ideas of male initiation. So instead what we have is kind of eternal childhood or eternal temper tantrums amongst the male, which is essentially what you see in the male, really all negative archetypes in The Force Awakens. So the male is either still the kind of dark father figure who is the kind of evil, pharaonic tyrant, subverter of the universe, or he's kind of the wimp who doubts himself, like the Starship Trooper, Finn, I think his name is, who kind of doesn't really want to be a cool, macho stormtrooper any longer. He's having issues with himself and he wants to talk about it, probably is a bit tearful. And that's another image of the modern male, which is gratifying to a certain type of roulette, sort of feminism. The man that actually is kind of touchy-feely, breaks down and isn't confident in his own role and his own masculinity. But there is nowhere in sight really a positive image of successful, initiated, sacred warriorhood. And it's hardly surprising that Lucas himself doesn't really like this new film, and is probably sorry that he sold the franchise. But this guy, Jeffrey Abrams, with, I think it's Kinberg, who also helped with the script, they're from a different world. They're not from the Campbell world, they're from a different universe. And of course they want to give the public what the public thinks, in terms of the only unassailable public certainty, which is the idea of the power, the warrior power, the initiative power of the female, and the implicit uselessness of the male. Where does this leave young men who still have the physiology of their ancestors and are looking, craving for forms of initiation and want a definition of gender? What is it to be growing into manhood? Is it just adolescence and physical changes and awkward hormones and not smelling too good? Or is there some significance to this? Secular world will say, well, you have to determine your own identity. Everything is in flux. You might even figure out that you want to determine your own sexuality at some point. You might decide on that. Or you might decide that you're in the wrong gender and you might have a sex change. And more people are having gender reassignment surgery. Nobody any longer belongs unambiguously to a particular set of coordinates. And that opens up all kinds of opportunities, no doubt, for human venturesomeness. But at the same time, young people are given very few landmarks, very little support. They're not really told what it is to be male any longer. They're not really told what it is to belong to a particular city or country or social class. Everything is in flux and negotiable. And as a result, a lot of people are breaking down, not just the absentee fathers, which are a catastrophe in the Western family, and the problem is getting worse, but also a lot of women who are experiencing problems with cutting, with dieting disorders, with anxiety, with depression. The species is really malfunctioning. So we need to think about ways in which the Sunnah might give us back something about gender. And I think one reason why people come into Islam is that it does actually give you not an absolute long checklist of exactly how you have to be if you're male or female, but it does give you a genuine sense of what is masculine and what is feminine. لَيْسَ الذَّكَرُ كَالْأُنْثَى. The male is not like the female. And these modern confusions that seek to turn us all into sort of equal consumers, really, because the more human differentiations there are, the harder it is for the advertising people to appeal to everybody. to melt us down into a single module of humanity that then has to make massive choices about identity, self and meaning, is something that Sunnah exists as probably the world's most successful and credible alternative to. The Sunnah does tell you what to do with your body and your spiritual life if you're specifically male or if you're specifically female. It does give you adab and forms of boundary protection for the all-important relationship between the genders, confusion about which causes so many issues with relationships in the modern world. It does give you a sense that male and female are not just random genetic outcomes, but actually have a deep significance. And that while we've never spoken in our heritage of an inner hierarchy, of one being superior to the other, we've always known that they were very different. And this is part of the strength of Islam, and one reason why it's so important for us to adhere to the Sunnah and not to attempt various forms of radical reconfiguration to try and bring Islam and its often detested gender beliefs into line with the current social beliefs of the modern world. We resist that. And those who are desperately trying to find sort of second wave feminism in the pages of the Quran and the Hadith, they'll be disappointed sooner or later because it's simply not there. And we are proud of our identity, just as others despise us for having it. And we note how a certain type of roulette feminism has actually mutated into an imperial rhetoric or discourse now, facilitating the bombing of Afghanistan and other Muslim countries. Because Muslims are so wicked to their women, therefore we can send the smart bombs and the drones and everything else. It's become, although feminism didn't set out to be that, increasingly it seems to become an ideology, a discourse of Western world domination. Because if the feminists are right, then the Westerner, white man, white woman, is right in categorically despising every other culture. Not just the Muslims, but the traditional Chinese, Hindus, New Guineans, native Australians, everybody else. It is the perfect weapon for empire builders. So we need to be aware of this, but we need to be aware also of the dangers of retreating into an over-reified and foolish extremism in gender modalities, which is reactive and not based on correct usul. If we look to the Quran and the Hadith for their models of gender essence and gender interaction, we will find the answers to these massive confusions that we are now seeing even on the silver screen and in the souls of so many puzzled and unhappy teenagers around the world. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.